This is how a millionaire trembles when a child points to him in a photo and says, "That's you, Daddy." A story of identity, hidden love, and the unexpected bond that shakes even the strongest man to his core. What happens when a man who has everything suddenly discovers he has nothing at all? Imagine this: you're worth $50 million. You live in a Manhattan penthouse. You command respect in every boardroom from New York to Silicon Valley. Your life is perfectly orchestrated, meticulously planned, and completely empty. Now, imagine walking into a small community center in Queens for what you think is just another routine charity photo op. You're surrounded by children's laughter, colorful artwork, and the kind of genuine joy that your world of corporate meetings and stock reports has forgotten exists. And then, a small voice behind you says 5 words that will shatter everything. You thought you knew about your life. That's you, Daddy. You turn around. Standing before you is a 6-year-old girl with eyes identical to your own, pointing at a photograph you recognize from 15 years ago. A photograph with a woman you loved and lost. A woman who, you're about to discover, carried a secret that would have changed everything. This is the story of Paul Morrison, a man who built an empire but lost his soul until one moment of truth forced him to choose between the life he had constructed and the family he never knew existed. What would you do if you discovered that your greatest success was also your greatest failure? What would you risk to become the person you were meant to be? Stay with me for the next 30 minutes, because this story will challenge everything you think you know about success, love, and the courage it takes to change your entire life for someone who shares your eyes and your heart. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Paul Morrison's Manhattan penthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floors. At 42, Paul had everything a man could want: a net worth exceeding $50 million, a corporate empire built from nothing, and a reputation that commanded respect in every boardroom from New York to Silicon Valley. He stood before his bathroom mirror, adjusting his Italian silk tie with practiced precision. The reflection staring back at him was that of a man who had conquered the world. Sharp jawline, piercing blue eyes, and an expression that betrayed nothing of the loneliness that had become his constant companion. "Mr. Morrison, your car is here," came the voice of his assistant Margaret through the intercom. "Thank you, Margaret. I'll be down in 5 minutes." Paul's penthouse was a testament to his success. Modern art adorning the walls, furniture that cost more than most people's, annual salaries, and a view of Central Park that real estate agents called priceless. Yet as he walked through the expansive living room, his footsteps echoed with a hollowness that no amount of luxury could fill. The elevator descended smoothly to the parking garage, where his driver, James, waited beside the black Mercedes S-Class. James had been with him for 8 years, yet their relationship remained strictly professional, a boundary Paul had carefully maintained with everyone in his life. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison. Heading to the office?" "Actually, James, there's been a change of plans." Paul pulled out his phone, reading the message that had arrived just minutes earlier. "I need to go to the Riverside Community Center in Queens. My PR team has arranged a charity visit." James raised an eyebrow slightly. Paul rarely deviated from his rigid schedule, but simply nodded. "Of course, sir. It'll take about 45 minutes with traffic." As they navigated through the city's bustling streets, Paul's mind wandered to the carefully orchestrated life he had built. After his parents died in a car accident when he was 25, he had thrown himself into building his tech company, Morrison Dynamics. Every relationship, every friendship, every connection had been filtered through the lens of business necessity. Love, he had convinced himself, was a luxury he couldn't afford. Too messy, too unpredictable, too dangerous for a man with his responsibilities. The Mercedes glided through Queens, leaving behind the gleaming towers of Manhattan for a neighborhood. where children played on fire escapes and corner stores displayed handwritten signs in multiple languages. The contrast wasn't lost on Paul as they pulled up to the Riverside Community Center, a modest two-story brick building with colorful murals painted by local children. "Wait here, James. This shouldn't take long." Margaret, a woman in her 50s, with silver hair and the efficiency of a Swiss watch, was waiting at the entrance with a small entourage of photographers and his PR manager, David Chen. "Paul, this is perfect timing," David said, his camera-ready smile never wavering. "The children are having their art class, and the director, Mrs. Rodriguez, is eager to show you their recent projects. We'll get some great shots for the Foundation's annual report." Paul nodded, slipping into the role he had perfected over the years, the benevolent millionaire, the successful businessman giving back to his community. It was a performance he had given countless times, and one that came as naturally as breathing. The community center buzzed with activity. In one room, teenagers practiced on donated instruments that had seen better days. In another, elderly residents played chess on worn boards. But it was the children's art room that caught Paul's attention. Bright, chaotic, filled with the kind of uninhibited creativity that his own world had long since abandoned. Mrs. Rodriguez, a warm woman in her 60s with paint-stained apron, greeted them enthusiastically. "Mr. Morrison, welcome. The children have been so excited to meet you. They've prepared a special presentation of their artwork." As they entered the art room, Paul was struck by the genuine joy on the children's faces. Unlike the adults in his world, they weren't trying to impress him or gain something from him. They were simply excited to share their creations with a visitor. "This is our community wall," Mrs. Rodriguez explained, gesturing to a large bulletin. Board covered with drawings, photos, and small essays. The children contribute stories about their families, their dreams, their heroes. It's our way of celebrating the diversity and strength of our neighborhood. Paul nodded politely, his practiced smile in place as David's photographer captured the moment. But then, something unexpected happened. A small voice piped up from behind him. "That's you, Daddy." The words hit Paul like a physical blow. He turned, slowly, his heart beginning to race in a way that had nothing to do with his morning espresso. Standing before him was a little girl, perhaps 6 years old, with dark curls and the most striking blue eyes he had ever seen. Eyes that mirrored his own. She was pointing at an old photograph pinned to the community wall, a picture that Paul recognized with growing horror. It was from 15 years ago, taken at a company retreat in the Hamptons. He was younger then, laughing at something off camera, his arm around a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a smile that had once made his heart skip. Sarah Martinez. The room seemed to spin around him. The chatter of children, the click of cameras, the warm praise from Mrs. Rodriguez. Everything faded into white noise as Paul stared at the little girl who had just called him Daddy. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" he managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. The little girl, Emma, Mrs. Rodriguez called her, looked up at him with those impossibly familiar blue eyes. "That's my daddy in the picture. Mama showed it to me lots of times before she went to heaven. She said he was a good man who worked very hard, but that sometimes good people don't know about the children who love them." Paul's knees nearly buckled. Sarah was dead, and this child, this beautiful, innocent child was... "Emma, sweetheart," Mrs. Rodriguez said gently. "This is Mr. Morrison. He's here to visit us today." "I know," Emma said simply. "He's my daddy. Mama said he has the same eyes as me, and that one day I might meet him when I was ready to understand." The photographer had stopped taking pictures. David was staring at Paul with a mixture of confusion and growing concern. Margaret had gone pale, her clipboard forgotten in her hands. Paul knelt down slowly, bringing himself to Emma's eye level. Up close, the resemblance was undeniable. The shape of her face, the curve of her smile, even the way she tilted her head when she was thinking. It was like looking at a feminine version of his own childhood photographs. "Emma," he said softly, his voice trembling despite his efforts to control it. "Can you tell me about your mama?" "She was the best mama in the world," Emma said proudly. "She worked here at the center, helping kids like me learn to read better. She got sick last year, and now I live with Mama Rodriguez. But she's not my real mama. My real mama went to heaven, but she said my daddy would find me when the time was right." Paul felt the world tilt beneath him. Sarah had worked here. Sarah had been sick. Sarah had died, and he had never known. And this child, his child, had been waiting for him in a place he had never thought to look. "Mr. Morrison?" David's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right? Should we continue with the tour?" Paul stood slowly, his mind reeling. With questions, with regret, with a pain so acute it took his breath away. He looked around the room, at the concerned faces of the adults, at the curious stares of the other children, at Emma, who was watching him with an expression of patient understanding that no 6-year-old should possess. I need a moment," he said, his voice hoarse. "Please excuse me." As he stepped outside into the crisp autumn air, Paul Morrison, a man who had built an empire on careful planning and calculated risks, realized that his perfectly ordered world had just been shattered by 5 simple words from a child who shared his eyes and, apparently, his heart. Behind him, through the window, he could see Emma continuing to point at the photograph, explaining to the other children with the matter-of-fact certainty of childhood that the man in the picture was her daddy, and that her mama had promised he would come back to her someday. For the first time in his adult life, Paul Morrison had no idea what to do next. Paul sat in his Mercedes for 20 minutes, staring at the community center through the tinted windows, while his mind raced through 15 years of carefully buried memories. Sarah Martinez had been more than just a brief relationship. She had been the woman who had almost convinced him that love was worth the risk. They had met at a tech conference in Austin, where she was representing a non-profit focused on digital literacy for underserved communities. Paul had been immediately drawn to her passion, her laugh, and the way she challenged his cynical worldview with genuine optimism. For 6 months, they had been inseparable. But then his company had faced a hostile takeover, and Paul had made the choice that would define the rest of his life. He had chosen business over love, success over vulnerability. He had broken up with Sarah via a cold, professional phone call, telling her that he couldn't afford distractions. He had convinced himself it was for the best, for both of them. He had never known she was pregnant. "Sir," James's voice broke through his reverie. "Mrs. Chen is asking if you'd like to reschedule the afternoon meetings." Paul looked at his phone. 17 missed calls from Margaret, 12 from David, and a string of text messages that grew increasingly frantic. The business world didn't stop for personal revelations, no matter how earth-shattering they might be. "Tell them I'll be there in an hour," Paul said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "And James, cancel everything for tomorrow. I need to think." As they drove back into Manhattan, Paul's phone rang. Margaret's name appeared on the screen. "Paul, thank God. David's having a panic attack about the photos. The photographer got several shots of you and the little girl before. Whatever happened, happened. We need to control the narrative before—" "Margaret!" Paul interrupted, his voice firm despite his inner turmoil. "I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it quietly. I want you to find out everything you can about Sarah Martinez. She worked at the Riverside Community Center, and she died sometime last year. I also need information about Emma Martinez. She's 6 years old, and she's currently living with someone named Mrs. Rodriguez." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Paul, What's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," Paul said quietly. "Just do this. For me, Margaret, and keep it confidential. I'll explain everything later." The rest of the drive passed in a blur. When they arrived at Morrison Dynamics headquarters, a gleaming 50-story tower in Midtown, Paul went straight to his office, ignoring the concerned looks from his staff and the string of meetings that Margaret had rescheduled. His office was a sanctuary of order and control, with its minimalist design and panoramic view of the city. But today, even this carefully curated environment felt foreign to him. Paul loosened his tie and sat heavily in his leather chair, staring at the photograph on his desk, a picture of him accepting an award for Entrepreneur of the Year 3 years ago. In the photo, he was smiling, but his eyes looked hollow. How had he never noticed that before? An hour later, Margaret knocked and entered with a manila folder that seemed to weigh more than it should. "I found what you asked for," she said softly, setting the folder on his desk. "Paul, I've worked for you for 8 years and I've never seen you like this. Whatever's in here, whatever happened today, I'm here if you need to talk." Paul opened the folder with hands that trembled slightly. The first document was Sarah's obituary from the Queen's Daily Herald, dated 14 months ago. Sarah Elena Martinez, 38, beloved daughter, mother, and community advocate, passed away on September 15th after a courageous battle with breast cancer. Sarah dedicated her life to improving literacy rates in underserved communities and was a cherished member of the Riverside Community Center family for over a decade. She's survived by her daughter, Emma, age 5, and countless friends and colleagues, whose lives she touched with her kindness and dedication. In lieu of flowers, the family requests donations be made to the Riverside Community Center's Children's Literacy Program. Paul's vision blurred as he read the words. Sarah had fought cancer alone. She had died alone, and Emma, their daughter, had lost her mother at 5 years old, just as Paul had lost his parents. The cruel symmetry of it made his chest ache. The next document was Emma's birth certificate. Father, unknown, but the date told the story Paul had dreaded to confirm. Emma had been born exactly 9 months after he had ended things with Sarah. Margaret had also included medical records, obtained through channels Paul didn't want to know about, school enrollment forms, and a report from Child Protective Services detailing Emma's placement with Maria Rodriguez, a licensed foster parent who had been Sarah's supervisor at the community center. The final item in the folder was a letter, written in Sarah's handwriting on Riverside Community Center letterhead. It was dated just 3 months before her death. Paul, I know you probably never expected to hear from me again, and I've spent 6 years convincing myself that I was right not to contact you. You made your choice clear when you ended things between us, and I respected that choice, even when it broke my heart. But I'm dying, Paul. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months left, and I can't leave this world without Emma knowing who her father is. She's so smart, so curious, so full of life. She reminds me of you in the best ways. She has your eyes, your stubborn streak, and your ability to see solutions where others see only problems. I'm not writing this letter to ask for anything. I made peace with raising Emma alone, and she's been the greatest joy of my life. But she deserves to know her story, to understand where she comes from. After I'm gone, she'll be staying with Maria Rodriguez, who's been like a grandmother to her. Maria knows about you, but she's promised to let Emma decide if and when she wants to reach out. I've enclosed a photo of Emma from her 6th birthday. She's starting to ask questions about her father, and I tell her the truth, that he's a good man who works very hard to help people, but that sometimes good people make choices that keep them apart from the ones they love. I don't expect you to be part of her life. I know the kind of man you are, the responsibilities you carry, But someday, if she asks about you, I want her to know that she was conceived in love, even if that love wasn't strong enough to last. Take care of yourself, Paul. And if you ever think of us, know that we both wish you well. Sarah P.S. I never mailed this letter. I couldn't bring myself to send it, but I'm keeping it in Emma's memory box, along with the photo from our weekend in the Hamptons. Maybe someday she'll understand why I made the choices I did. Paul's hands were shaking as he set the letter down. Sarah had written to him. She had wanted to tell him about Emma, but something had stopped her. Pride, fear, or maybe she had simply accepted that he was exactly the kind of man who would choose success over family, because that's exactly what he had done, even before he knew what he was giving up. He looked at the enclosed photograph, a picture of Emma blowing out 6 candles on a homemade birthday cake, her eyes bright with joy and innocence. She was beautiful, and she was his daughter. His daughter, who had spent the first 6 years of her life believing her father was too important to love her. Margaret had been quietly watching him read. "Paul," she said gently, "what are you going to do?" Paul stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city he had conquered but never truly belonged to. "I don't know," he admitted. "I built my entire life on the assumption that I was better off alone, that caring about people, letting them in, was a weakness I couldn't afford. And now you've discovered you have a daughter who's been waiting for you to find her. She's better off without me, Margaret. Look at this life I've built. It's all work, all isolation. What do I know about being a father? What do I know about love?" Margaret walked over to stand beside him at the window. "Maybe that's not the right question," she said softly. "Maybe the question is, what do you want to learn?" Below them, the city hummed with life. Millions of people making choices, taking risks, building families, and creating connections that Paul had always convinced himself were luxuries he couldn't afford. But today, for the first time, the view from his ivory tower looked less like success and more like a prison of his own making. His phone buzzed with another urgent message about quarterly reports and board meetings and strategic initiatives that had seemed so important just hours ago. But all Paul could think about was a little girl with his eyes and her mother's heart, living in a world he had never bothered to see, waiting for a father who had been too afraid to love anyone, including himself. The weight of 15 years of carefully constructed loneliness settled on his shoulders, and Paul Morrison realized that all his success meant nothing if he was going to remain the kind of man who could walk away from his own child twice. Paul spent the night in his office, something he hadn't done since the early days of building his company, but this time it wasn't deadlines or deals that kept him awake. It was the growing realization that he had to make a choice that would define not just his future, but Emma's as well. At dawn, he stood at his window watching the city wake up, and for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about market openings or quarterly projections. He was thinking about a 6-year-old girl who had looked at a photograph and recognized her father in a stranger's face. Margaret arrived at 7, earlier than usual, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who had spent her own sleepless night worrying about her boss. "You look terrible," she said without preamble, setting one of the cups on his desk. "Thank you for your honesty," Paul said with a weak smile. "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. In all the years you've worked for me, have you ever seen me truly happy?" Margaret sat down across from him, studying his face with the careful attention of someone who had spent years managing his schedule and, by extension, his life. "You've been satisfied," she said finally. "You've been successful. You've been content, I suppose. But happy? Paul, I don't think you've allowed yourself to be happy. It's like you've been afraid that if you let your guard down, if you let yourself feel joy, everything you've built would somehow disappear. And what if it did? What if I'm not capable of being the kind of person Emma needs? What if I'm too damaged, too set in my ways. Or, Margaret said gently, what if she's exactly what you need to become the person you were meant to be? At 10 o'clock, Paul did something unprecedented. He cancelled all his meetings for the entire week. Then he called James and asked to be driven back to Queens. The Riverside Community Center looked different in the morning light, less imposing and more welcoming. Children's laughter echoed from the playground, and the smell of breakfast cooking drifted from the kitchen. Paul stood at the entrance for several minutes, gathering his courage. Mrs. Rodriguez was waiting for him in her office, as if she had expected him to return. She was a small woman with kind eyes and hands that bore the calluses of someone who had spent her life in service to others. Mr. Morrison, she said, gesturing for him to sit. Emma told me you were her father. She was very matter-of-fact about it, the way children are when they're stating something they consider obvious. Mrs. Rodriguez, Maria, I need you to know that I had no idea about Emma, about Sarah's illness, about any of it. If I had known, what would you have done? She asked, and her tone was neither accusatory nor judgmental, simply curious. Paul was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, he admitted, and that's what scares me. I've spent 15 years convincing myself that I made the right choice when I ended things with Sarah. I told myself I was protecting her from a man who couldn't give her what she deserved, but the truth is, I was protecting myself. Maria nodded. Sarah was a remarkable woman. When she found out she was pregnant, she could have tried to contact you, could have demanded support or acknowledgement. But she chose to raise Emma with love and dignity, to speak about you with respect rather than bitterness. She wanted Emma to be proud of where she came from. I failed them both. You made a choice based on fear, Maria corrected gently. But you're here now. The question is, what choice are you going to make today? As if summoned by their conversation, Emma appeared in the doorway. She was wearing a bright yellow dress and had paint smudges on her fingers from art class. When she saw Paul, her face lit up with a smile that was so purely joyful it took his breath away. You came back, she said simply, as if his return had been inevitable. I did, Paul said, kneeling to her level. Emma, I want to talk to you about some important things. Is that okay? She nodded solemnly and climbed into the chair beside him. Mama Rodriguez said you didn't know about me. Is that true? Yes, it's true. If I had known about you, everything would have been different. Mama always said that people make the best choices they can with what they know at the time. She said, that's how forgiveness works. Paul felt his throat tighten. Your mama was very wise. She was, Emma agreed. She said that someday I might meet you, and that I should remember that families can be made in lots of different ways. She said the most important thing is that people choose to love each other. Emma, Paul said carefully, I want you to know that I would very much like to be part of your life if you want that too. But I need to be honest with you. I don't know very much about being a daddy. I might make mistakes. Emma considered this with the seriousness that children bring to important decisions. That's okay, she said finally. I don't know very much about having a daddy either. We can learn together. Over the next 2 hours, Paul experienced something entirely foreign to him. The simple pleasure of getting to know another person without agenda or strategy. Emma showed him her artwork, introduced him to her friends, and told him stories about her mother with the unself-conscious honesty of childhood. He learned that Emma loved to read, but struggled with math, that she wanted to be a teacher like her mama when she grew up, and that her favorite color was blue because it's the color of Daddy's eyes. He learned that she missed her mother every day, but that Maria Rodriguez had become her chosen grandmother, providing stability and love in the wake of unimaginable loss. Most importantly, he learned that Emma had been waiting for him not with resentment or demands, but with the patient hope that only children possess, the belief that love, once acknowledged, could overcome any obstacle. When it was time for lunch, Emma took his hand with the casual trust of a child who had already decided he belonged in her world. Her small fingers in his large ones felt like both a gift and a responsibility more profound than any business deal he had ever negotiated. "Mr. Morrison," Maria said as they sat down to eat with the other children, "there are legal matters we'll need to discuss. Emma's guardianship, visitation schedules, the practical aspects of building a relationship. But today isn't about paperwork. Today is about two people getting to know each other." Paul nodded, watching Emma as she chatted with the other children about their morning activities. She had an easy way with people, a warmth that drew others to her, qualities she had inherited from her mother, not from him. "I want to do this right," he said quietly to Maria. "I want to be the father she deserves, not just the one she happened to get." "Then you'll need to learn to forgive yourself," Maria replied. "Emma already has. Children are remarkably good at accepting love when it's offered genuinely. It's adults who complicate things with guilt and fear." As the afternoon wore on, Paul found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years. Emma's laughter was infectious, her curiosity was endless, and her acceptance of him was both humbling and healing. For the first time since he was a child himself, Paul forgot to check his phone, forgot about the stock market, forgot about everything except the present moment, and the little girl who was teaching him that love didn't require perfection. It only required presence. When it was time to leave, Emma hugged him goodbye with fierce intensity. "Will you come back tomorrow?" she asked. "If you want me to," Paul replied. "I do, and maybe someday you can come to dinner at Maria's house. She makes the best arroz con pollo in Queens." As Paul drove back to Manhattan, the city skyline looked different somehow, less like a fortress and more like a place where people lived and loved and built families. His phone was full of missed calls and urgent messages, but for the first time in his adult life, Paul Morrison had found something more important than business. He had found his daughter, and in doing so, he had begun to find himself. 3 months later, Paul's life looked nothing like the carefully orchestrated existence he had maintained for decades. His penthouse, once a showcase of expensive solitude, now had a small bedroom decorated with princesses and rainbow art that Emma had created during their weekend visits. His refrigerator, previously stocked only with organic produce that often went bad, now contained juice boxes, string cheese, and the ingredients for pancakes, Emma's favorite breakfast. The transformation hadn't been easy. Paul had hired the best family lawyers in the city to navigate the adoption process, but Emma's integration into his life required changes that no legal document could mandate. He had to learn patience when helping with homework, creativity when planning activities, and humility when admitting he didn't know the words to children's songs or the rules to playground games. Margaret had initially worried that his newfound fatherhood would destroy his business focus, but the opposite had proven true. Paul found himself more efficient, more decisive, and paradoxically more successful than ever before. Having a reason to leave the office at reasonable hours had forced him to delegate more effectively and prioritize what truly mattered. "You seem different," his business partner Michael Chen had observed during a board meeting. "More present, I suppose. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Our Q4 numbers are the best we've ever had." What Paul was doing was learning to love, and being loved in return. Emma had taken to calling him Daddy Paul to distinguish him from the father she had imagined for 6 years, and the name had stuck throughout the extended family at the Riverside Community Center. He had become not just Emma's father, but a regular volunteer, a major donor, and an unlikely friend to people whose lives bore no resemblance to his previous social circle. Maria Rodriguez had become his unlikely mentor in parenthood, teaching him that being a good father wasn't about providing expensive gifts or elaborate experiences, It was about showing up consistently, listening without judgment, and creating a safe space for a child to grow into their own person. Parenting isn't about perfection, she had told him during one of their regular coffee meetings. It's about repair. You make mistakes, you acknowledge them, you make amends, and you do better next time. Emma doesn't need a perfect father. She needs a real one. The legal adoption had been finalized on a cold February morning in Queen's family court. Emma, now 7, had worn her best dress and held Paul's hand as the judge made their relationship official. Afterward, they had celebrated with ice cream and a trip to the Central Park Zoo, Emma's choice, where she had insisted on seeing every animal and reading every information plaque aloud. But the most profound changes in Paul's life weren't legal or logistical. They were emotional. For the first time since his parents' death, he experienced the daily miracle of unconditional love. Emma loved him on days when he was patient and days when he was grumpy, when he succeeded at building her elaborate Lego castles, and when he failed spectacularly at braiding her hair. She loved him not for what he could provide, but simply for who he was when he was with her. In return, Paul discovered that loving Emma didn't diminish him. It expanded him. His capacity for joy, for wonder, for hope had grown exponentially. He found himself noticing things he had ignored for years: the changing seasons, the laughter of children, the satisfaction of helping someone without expecting anything in return. "Daddy Paul," Emma said one evening as they walked through Central Park after dinner, "do you think Mama can see us from heaven?" They had developed a tradition of evening walks when Emma stayed with him, using the time to talk about important things in the way that only happens when you're moving together through the world. "I think she can," Paul said, adjusting Emma's scarf against the cool spring air. "What do you think she would say if she could see us now?" Emma was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness she brought to all discussions about her mother. "I think she would be happy that we found each other, and I think she would be proud of how much you love me now. I've always loved you, Emma. Even before I knew you existed, some part of me was waiting for you." "I know," she said simply. "That's why it felt right when I saw your picture. Love recognizes love, even when it's been waiting a long time." As they walked home, Paul reflected on the man he had been just months earlier. Successful but hollow, wealthy but impoverished in the ways that truly mattered. Emma had not only given him the gift of her love, she had shown him that the capacity for love had been there all along, waiting for someone brave enough to claim it. His phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "Emergency board meeting tomorrow at 8 a.m. Hostile takeover attempt from Apex Corp. Need you there." A year ago, such a message would have sent Paul into crisis mode, would have consumed his every thought until the threat was neutralized. Tonight, he simply texted back, "Schedule it for 10 a.m. I'm taking Emma to school tomorrow morning," because Paul Morrison had finally learned the difference between urgent and important, between success and significance. He had built a fortune, but Emma had taught him to build a life. He had conquered the business world, but she had shown him how to surrender to love. As they reached his building, Emma slipped her small hand into his large one. A gesture that had become as natural as breathing, but never ceased to amaze him. "Daddy Paul," she said, "I'm glad you came back that day." "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." Above them, the lights of Manhattan sparkled like stars, each one representing a life, a story, a chance for connection. Paul Morrison looked up at them and realized that his story, their story, was just beginning. He had spent 42 years building walls, but a 6-year-old girl with his eyes and her mother's heart had taught him something far more valuable: how to build a family. And for the first time in his life, Paul Morrison was exactly where he belonged. The Riverside Community Center's annual fundraising gala had never been held in a Manhattan ballroom before, but then again, it had never had Paul Morrison as its chairman of the board. What had started as a simple charity visit had evolved into a passionate commitment to the community that had given him his greatest gift. Emma, now 8 and radiant in a dress she had picked out herself, stood beside Paul as he addressed the crowd of donors, community members, and local officials who had gathered to celebrate the center's expansion into a second location. A little over a year ago, Paul began, his voice carrying easily through the elegant ballroom. I thought I understood what success looked like. I measured it in quarterly reports, stock prices, and business awards. I was wrong. He looked down at Emma, who gave him an encouraging smile. Success isn't about what you accumulate, it's about what you contribute. It's not about the size of your portfolio, it's about the size of your impact on the lives of others. And it's not about achieving perfection, it's about having the courage to be present, to be vulnerable, and to choose love even when it requires you to change everything you thought you knew about yourself. The applause was warm and sustained, but Paul barely heard it. His attention was focused on Emma, on Maria Rodriguez beaming at them from the front row, and on the community of people who had taught him that family isn't always about blood. It's about choice, commitment, and the daily decision to show up for each other. Later, as they drove home through the city that had become not just Paul's domain, but their shared world, Emma fell asleep in her car seat, her head resting against the window. Paul watched her in the rearview mirror. This miracle child who had pointed to a photograph and changed his life with 5 simple words. His phone was full of messages from business associates, congratulating him on the successful event and discussing upcoming deals. But Paul's attention was on the small, sleeping figure in the back seat and the profound truth she had taught him, that the most important business in life is the business of loving and being loved. As they pulled into the garage of what was now truly their home, Paul realized that he was no longer the man who had walked into the Riverside Community Center a year ago. That man had been successful but empty, wealthy but impoverished in the ways that mattered most. This man, Emma's father, Maria's friend, the community's advocate, was still wealthy, still successful. But now he was also something infinitely more valuable. He was whole. Emma stirred as he unbuckled her seatbelt, opening sleepy eyes that mirrored his own. "Are we home, Daddy Paul?" she asked softly. "Yes, sweetheart, we're home." And as Paul carried his daughter up to their apartment, past the expensive art and designer furniture that had once defined his worth, he understood that home wasn't a place, it was a feeling. It was the weight of a sleeping child in your arms, the trust of small fingers curled around your neck, and the knowledge that somewhere in the world there was someone whose day was better simply because you existed. The millionaire who had once trembled at the sound of a child calling him daddy now stood taller because of it. He had learned that real wealth couldn't be measured in dollars or acquisitions. It was measured in bedtime stories read with silly voices, in scraped knees kissed better, in the fierce, protective love that had awakened in him the moment Emma had pointed to that photograph and claimed him as her own. Paul Morrison had spent his life building an empire, but his daughter had taught him something infinitely more valuable: how to build a legacy of love. And as he tucked Emma into her bed, surrounded by the drawings she had made, the books they read together, and the photos of the family they had become, he knew that no business success could ever compare to the simple miracle of being someone's daddy. In the end, the millionaire didn't tremble because he was afraid. He had trembled because, for the first time in his life, he had found something worth everything he had built, and discovered it had been waiting for him all along in the form of a little girl with his eyes and her mother's boundless capacity for love. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace. But inside their home, Paul Morrison had finally found what he had been searching for without even knowing it: the courage to love and be loved in return. And that, he realized as he watched, his daughter sleep peacefully in the life they had built together, was the only success that truly mattered. And this is how a millionaire trembles when a child points to him in a photo and says, "That's you, Daddy?" If this story moved you, don't leave just yet. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss moments like this again. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to know.